The trauma room smelled like blood and burning wire when Dr. Harrison Volk screamed at her to get out. She didn't move. The monitor flatlined. Every nurse in the corridor stepped back. The attending physician had already called time of death 37 seconds ago, and the man on the table was gone by every standard of modern medicine. Then Mara Solis pressed 2 fingers to the patient's neck, reached into her scrub pocket, and pulled out a vial that wasn't on any hospital formulary in the state of Tennessee. "What the hell is that?" Volk demanded. She uncapped the needle. The patient's eyes opened. Before we go any further, if stories like this keep you up at night, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell, because we drop new cinematic stories every single week, and you will not want to miss what's coming next. Tap the like button and leave a comment telling me what city, what country are you watching from right now. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The rain had been falling since Tuesday. By Thursday morning, it was the kind of rain that makes a city feel like a different place, entirely gutters, choked and running brown, windshields useless before the wipers finished a single pass. The low, distant percussion of fender benders echoing down Meridian Avenue like an argument. Nobody was winning. Mara Solis drove her 12-year-old Civic through it with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, the way she drove every morning without exception. No music, no talk shows, just the sound of water against glass and the particular interior silence she had spent years learning to maintain. She was 34 years old. She had worked at 4 years old at Hartwell Regional Medical Center in Nashville for 3 years, and 4 months, if she was counting, which she wasn't 11 days. In that time, she had learned exactly how much space she was permitted to occupy. The far end of the nursing station, the back corner of the break room, the 2 seconds of eye contact that were acceptable before a senior attending looked through her, rather than at her and moved on to someone whose opinion they'd already decided to value. She had learned to make herself small. She had become, without any particular drama, very good at it. The emergency department was already running at capacity when she badged through the staff entrance at 6:48. 3 ambulances in the last 90 minutes, a multi-car collision on the interstate, had compressed the highway into a parking lot of crumpled metal and shattered glass, and the overnight shift looked like it had been running on coffee and stubbornness for the last 2 hours. The morning charge nurse had called out sick. That meant Mara would absorb her triage assessment duties on top of her standard rotation without anyone formally asking her or thanking her for it. She pulled her dark hair into a bun, tucked one loose strand behind her ear, and moved to the board without being asked. Solis. The voice hit her from behind, like a door, closing flat, dismissive, carrying the specific tone of a man who had never once in his professional life questioned whether a room belonged to him. Dr. Harrison Volk was 49, head of emergency medicine at Hartwell Regional, and built from the kind of professional confidence that calcifies over decades into something indistinguishable from arrogance. He had a square jaw, silver-threaded hair he kept short and neat, and a habit of addressing nurses by their last names, while expecting everyone below his pay grade to call him doctor. He didn't look at her when he spoke. He was already reviewing the board. "You're covering room 4 and overflow. Stay out of room 6. I'm managing that case personally." "Understood," Mara said. He was already walking away when she said it. She had been invisible to him for 3 years. That arrangement suited her fine. She had been invisible in far worse places than a level 2 trauma center in Tennessee. Room 4 was a 17-year-old boy named Marcus who had been in the back seat of his mother's car when the pileup happened. Dislocated shoulder, minor lacerations to the forearm, and the specific kind of frightened that teenage boys get when they're trying very hard not to show anyone that they're frightened. Mara worked through his intake assessment with a quietness that she had noticed over the years tended to do more for a patient's nervous system than half the anxiolytics in the formulary. She wasn't performing calm. She simply was calm, in the way that people are calm when they have been in enough situations where panic was not an available option, and the body eventually stops reaching for it. She had learned that in a different life. She kept that life behind a door she did not open. By 7:40, she had cleared 2 additional intake assessments, managed discharge paperwork on a scalp laceration, restocked the procedure cart in Bay 3, and was at the nursing station working through documentation when the radio transmission came across the trauma channel. Ambulance inbound, 4 minutes out. Male, approximately late 30s to early 40s, discovered unresponsive on the highway median, roughly 200 meters from the primary collision site. No identification on his person. Vitals unstable. Mechanism of injury unclear. She registered the phrasing. Mechanism of injury unclear was what paramedics said when they genuinely did not know what had happened to the person in their rig, which was different from not having a witness account. It meant the physical evidence wasn't telling a coherent story. She went back to her documentation. The ambulance reversed into the bay at 8:17. She heard the doors come open, heard the medics pushing the gurney and calling out numbers in that rapid, overlapping cadence that emergency crews develop after years of working together, BP 62 over 41 and falling. Heart rate irregular at 116, GCS assessed at 6, 2 large bore IVs placed in the field, 1 liter saline in with minimal response. She heard Volk's voice cut through it with the practiced authority of a man who used certainty as a management tool. Trauma 1. Everyone move. Mara kept writing. The trauma bay door swung shut behind them. For roughly 9 minutes, everything proceeded in the recognizable rhythm of a serious and trauma case being managed by a team that knew its choreography. She could track it through the wall, the ordered urgency, the specific vocabulary, the sound of a unit doing its job. Then something shifted in the texture of what she was hearing. She couldn't have articulated it precisely. It was less a specific sound than an absence of beat that arrived slightly wrong, a hesitation in the rhythm where there shouldn't have been one. The way a musician who has played a piece 100 times suddenly lands a note that's technically in range, but resonates wrong against everything around it. She set her pen down. She walked to the trauma bay door. The narrow, reinforced window gave her a partial view of the room. The patient was on the table, male, dark hair, lean and well-muscled in a way that spoke less of gym culture and more of functional conditioning, the kind of body that was built for a specific purpose. The paramedics had established their lines, and Volk was at the head of the bed directing the assessment. The pressure readings on the monitor had barely moved despite the saline, hovering at 68 over 43. His color was wrong, not the chalky gray-white of hemorrhagic shock. Something else, a subtle ashy undertone that she had seen before in a context that had nothing to do with emergency medicine as it was practiced in civilian hospitals. She looked at his hands, rigid, not the soft, gradual stiffening of someone in pain. Rigid in a way that tracked differently a pattern she recognized as peripheral musculature, responding to a disrupted autonomic signal rather than voluntary or pain response tension. She looked at his lips. The faint blue edge at the corners was not pronounced, enough to catch a quick visual assessment from someone who wasn't specifically looking for it. She looked at his pupils. Someone on the team had positioned the overhead light almost perfectly above his face, and from where she stood, she could see both eyes clearly. His pupils were pinpoint, both of them, equal and fixed. She stood very still, pinpoint bilateral pupils, peripheral cyanosis at the lips, rigid extremity musculature without any reported spinal injury mechanism, blood pressure failing to respond to aggressive fluid resuscitation, heart rate irregular in a pattern that did not match blood loss. She had seen this before, not in any hospital, in a field, in the dark, in conditions she was not permitted to describe in any document that bore her real name. A soldier had gone down with this exact presentation after exposure to a synthetic organophosphate compound that was not listed in any publicly accessible toxicology database. She had been 26 years old, running under a call sign rather than a name, and she had known within 45 seconds what she was looking at and what needed to happen in the next 2 minutes for the man to be alive at the end of them. She watched Volk turn toward the medication tray, midazolam. She could read the label from outside the door. Standard protocol for a patient demonstrating pre-seizure rigidity, which this man technically appeared to be doing if you were reading the musculature without understanding what was actually causing it. It was a reasonable clinical decision based on the information Volk had and the framework he was applying. It would also, given this patient's current autonomic state, suppress his already compromised respiratory drive to a level from which it would not recover. His heart would stop. She estimated 4 minutes, possibly less. She stood outside the door, and she counted to 3. Then she pushed it open. Dr. Volk. She kept her voice level and direct, no apology in it, no hedging. Halt on that sedative. The room went quiet the specific way. Rooms go quiet when someone at the bottom of a hierarchy has said something that violates the understood order of things. Not a dramatic silence, just a sudden, collective pause in which everyone recalibrates. Volk turned slowly. He had the syringe in his hand with the cap already off. His expression moved through surprise and landed somewhere colder. Solis. He said her name the way someone says "excuse me" when they mean nothing of the kind. This room is closed. His pupils are bilateral pinpoint, she said, stepping inside. He isn't going into tonic seizure. He's presenting with autonomic suppression. Midazolam will kill his respiratory drive. A second-year resident named Dr. Pavel Greer looked up from the IV line with the expression of someone who desperately wanted to be somewhere else. The 2 nurses on either side of the bed went very still in the particular way of people, deciding whether this moment was happening to them or not. I am aware of his pupil presentation, Volk said, with the precise measured quality of someone exercising significant restraint. I am also aware that his musculature is progressing toward full tonic rigidity, which requires sedation before we can safely intubate him. It's not tonic rigidity from CNS activity, Mara said. She moved 2 steps closer to the bed. Check his hand temperature against his core. His periphery is cold, but his core temp is elevated. That's not seizure progression. That's autonomic dysregulation. His pressure isn't responding to volume, because this isn't a volume problem. She looked directly at Volk. Something is blocking his acetylcholine receptors. He was poisoned before he ever got into that ambulance. The word sat in the room, and nobody moved it. Volk stared at her. She watched him work through it, the word, the source, the implications of the source. She watched him make his decision. "Get her out," he said to the security desk nurse positioned by the door. "Please, Dr. Volk, get her out of my trauma room. Right now." The nurse took a step toward Mara. Mara didn't move. On the monitor, the patient's heart rate was sliding 108, 99, 93. The trajectory was not ambiguous. She had perhaps 90 seconds before the graph told a story that nobody in this room was going to be able to revise. "I have a compound that can reverse it," she said. That stopped him, not because he believed her, because the sentence was so completely outside the framework of what a floor nurse was supposed to say that his brain couldn't immediately file it anywhere. In that half-second gap, that small window of pure cognitive surprise, she held his gaze, and something in her eyes must have reached past the framework, because he didn't speak, and he didn't administer the sedative. She didn't ask for anything further. She crossed to the patient's bedside, reached into the front pocket of her scrubs, and withdrew a small, sealed vial. No commercial label. An alphanumeric identifier in small printed text, the kind of designation used by programs that don't publish their supply chains. She had carried it for 3 years in the pocket of every pair of scrubs she owned, the way some people carry a specific tool they hope they'll never need. The weight of it had become part of her daily inventory, like keys and a phone, and she had spent 3 years hoping it would stay sealed. "What is that?" Volk demanded. "A nerve conduction stabilizer." She was already drawing the dose, calculating by weight estimate. The patient was approximately 83 kilos, lean, and the compound's therapeutic window was narrow enough that precision mattered. It's designed to reverse autonomic blockade caused by organophosphate class neurotoxic compounds. Your patient was poisoned. This isn't a trauma case. Someone put something in him before or during that accident, and if we give him anything that further suppresses his autonomic function, we are going to lose him in the next 2 minutes. Volk moved, not toward the patient, toward her. You cannot administer an unidentified substance to a patient in this. "Then physically stop me," she said. She injected it into the IV line. The room held its breath. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. 4. The monitor displayed its numbers with complete indifference to the tension in the room. Then, on the 5th second, the patient's heart rate dropped sharply, 93 to 61 to 34 to 18. Then the line went flat. The monitor issued a single sustained tone. Asystoles. Compressions, Mara said immediately, her voice carrying the same level quality it had held since she walked through the door. "Start compressions now." Nobody moved. They were all looking at her, at the nurse, who had just administered an unknown drug to a patient who had now flatlined in front of witnesses. Compressions. She said it one more time, and something in the steadiness of it, the complete absence of panic, in a moment that had every reason for panic, broke through. Dr. Greer moved to the chest and started compressions without being asked twice. Mara drew epinephrine from the crash cart. Standard dose, standard route, nothing classified, but the timing was everything, and she calculated it against what she knew about the compound's metabolic clearance timeline, which was information that did not appear in any pharmacology textbook published for civilian use. She administered it and watched the monitor, watching the patient's color counting silently. 20 seconds, 30, 41, 53. The monitor blipped. Once, uncertain, like a question. Then again. Then the unsteady, ragged trace of a heartbeat came back, weak and arrhythmic but present, the cardiac muscle re-establishing its signal against everything that had been working to shut it down. Mara exhaled, small, controlled. She allowed herself exactly that. Continue compressions for 30 more seconds to ensure perfusion, then reassess rhythm, she said. Get a tox panel running, specifically request organophosphate compound screening, not the standard tox screen, and call the police. She looked at Volk. Not hospital security. Police. This man was poisoned. Someone needs to establish a chain of custody on his clothing and personal effects before they disappear. The room was silent in a way that was different from before. Before it had been the silence of shock. Now it was the silence of people who had watched something happen that they didn't have an existing category for. Volk looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient, whose color was slowly improving, not good, not safe, but moving in the right direction. He looked at Mara. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and very controlled. Everyone except Dr. Greer and primary nursing step out. The room cleared. Mara stayed where she was. Volk moved to stand directly in front of her. Close enough that she could see the specific way his jaw was set, the muscle working slightly at the corner, the physiological signature of a man exercising careful control over something he would rather express differently. "I don't know what that compound was," he said, low and precise. "I don't know where you obtained it or why it was in your pocket. What I do know is that you entered a secured trauma room without authorization, administered an unlabeled pharmaceutical to a critically ill patient, and induced cardiac arrest. The patient's current stability does not erase any of those facts. He was going to die from your midazolam. That assessment was not yours to make." She looked at him. Someone had to make it. Something moved in his expression, something that wasn't quite anger, and wasn't quite doubt, and wasn't quite any emotion she could name cleanly. He held her gaze for a moment. Then you're suspended pending formal review. Leave your badge at the station. She studied him for one beat. Then she unclipped her badge from her scrubs and set it on the counter beside the door without any dramatic gesture, and walked out. She collected her jacket from the break room. A second-year nurse named Del Rey caught her eye in the corridor. Young, careful, one of the few people in this department who had consistently treated her like a person rather than a function, and started to say something. Mara gave a small, quiet shake of her head. Don't. Del Rey pressed her lips together and looked at the floor. The elevator took her to the lobby. She pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the rain. It was still coming down with the same indifferent intensity it had maintained for 2 days. She stood under the entrance overhang and pulled her jacket closed and tried to identify what she was feeling. She had a rent payment due in 9 days, a savings account that covered approximately 6 weeks of careful, minimal living. No references she could use that wouldn't require explaining things she had spent years not explaining. No employment history from the 7 years before Hartwell Regional that she could put on a resume without triggering questions she was not prepared to answer. She had saved a man's life. She found her car in the parking structure on the second level, sat down behind the wheel, and put both hands in her lap. Rain on the roof. She stayed there for a long moment without starting the engine. Her phone buzzed. Text from Volk's administrative coordinator brief. Formal, confirming suspension effective. Immediately. Termination paperwork to follow within 72 hours. HR would be in contact regarding the formal review process. She read it twice. Set the phone on the passenger seat face down. She sat for another minute. Then she started the car. She had pulled out of the parking space and was moving toward the structure exit when she heard it. Her body recognized the sound before her mind finished processing it. It was a response that lived below conscious thought, below 3 years of careful reconstruction in some layer of her nervous system that had been trained by a different life and did not forget. The rotational frequency of military rotorcraft, not one aircraft but multiple, and not at cruising altitude. Close, descending with purpose. She stopped the car. Through the rain-blurred windshield of the parking structure's open side wall, she watched 2 helicopters materialize out of the low cloud cover above the hospital. They came in steep and fast, the aggressive angle of aircraft with specific tactical objectives rather than standard approach protocols. They didn't land, they held position, rotors churning the rain into horizontal sheets, while a third and larger aircraft descended toward the street in front of the main hospital entrance and set down with an impact that she felt in the parking structure's concrete columns. The street below was already transformed. Black SUVs, she counted 4, no visible plates were staged at both ends of the block. Personnel in tactical clothing were moving to the hospital entrance with the unhurried precision of people who had done this particular thing many times and knew exactly what each of them was supposed to be doing. No visible law enforcement markings, no public address, no spectacle at all, which was itself its own kind of statement. This was a security operations that understood how to occupy space without drawing civilian attention, and it was being executed with a discipline that had a very specific origin. Mara sat completely still. She knew this operational signature. She had worked inside it. She understood the doctrine that shaped it, the way perimeter was established, the positioning of the vehicles, the way the personnel moved relative to each other and to the building entrance. This was not a federal law enforcement action. Federal law enforcement, even at its most discreet, carried certain procedural requirements that created a particular visible texture. This was different. This was a military security element operating under direct command authority, moving to secure something in that building, with an urgency calibrated precisely to the threat level they had assessed. A figure stepped out of the lead SUV. He was tall, she estimated 6'2", and wore a uniform she could not read in detail from this distance and this light, but his bearing was unmistakable. Not the bearing of rank alone. The bearing of someone who had operated in high-stakes environments for long enough that authority had stopped being a performance and become simply a quality of how he moved through space. 2 aides flanked him at a practiced distance. He walked toward the hospital entrance at a pace that was neither rushed nor casual, the pace someone who understood that the situation was being managed and that managed situations did not require sprinting. The security guard at the entrance stepped aside before the man's hand reached the door. Mara watched until the figure disappeared inside. Then she looked at the helicopters still holding position overhead. Then at the SUVs blocking the street. She finally put the car in gear. She drove 2 blocks on autopilot, muscle memory navigating the wet streets, while some other part of her mind turned over what she had just witnessed, and the patient she had just left behind, and the compound she had just administered, and the compound, the 3 years she had spent being invisible, and the door she kept shut that she had, 11 minutes ago in a trauma room, opened wider than she had intended. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She let it ring through. It rang again, immediately. Same number. She pulled to the curb, engine running, rain on the roof. She picked up. Solis, she said. A pause. Then a voice she had not heard in 3 years, calm, clipped, carrying the particular quality of someone who filtered every word before releasing it. We have a situation. She closed her eyes. 1 breath. Slow. 2. She knew the voice. She knew what the voice represented. And she understood, in the space of those 2 breaths, that the man on the table in Trauma Room 1, the man with the pinpoint pupils, and the poisoned autonomic system and no identification, was not a random casualty of a highway accident. And the general who had just walked into Hartwell Regional Medical Center was not there for the patient alone. Back in the trauma bay, on a monitor that was showing a stabilizing but precarious heart rhythm, a man whose name nobody in that building had yet confirmed was fighting his way back from something that should have killed him twice. In his coat locked in the security cabinet, with his other personal effects, was a piece of encrypted data storage that contained intelligence implicating a network of people in positions they were not supposed to hold. And in the parking structure, 2 blocks away, a nurse who had spent 3 years becoming invisible was sitting in a 12-year-old Civic with a phone pressed to her ear, listening to a voice from her other life, listening to a voice from her tell her that the thing she had spent 3 years running from had just walked through the front door of the hospital she'd just been fired from. The rain didn't stop. She didn't drive away. "Talk to me," she said. The voice on the phone belonged to a man named Reyes, not his real name, never his real name, but the one she had known him by through 4 years of operations she could not discuss and would not. He was the kind of person who existed in the infrastructure of classified work, the way load-bearing walls exist in buildings, invisible, essential, and only noticed when something went wrong. "The man in your trauma room," Reyes said. "His name is Captain Dominic Farrell. Special Operations. He was transporting intelligence out of a compromised network when his vehicle was run off the highway. The accident wasn't an accident." Mara watched the rain on her windshield. The poison. Synthetic OP compound. Modified. Civilian tox panels won't flag it. It was designed that way. A pause. "You recognized it?" "Yes. That's why I'm calling you." Another pause. Shorter. "General Aldrich Voss is on his way into your hospital right now. He's going to want to talk to whoever saved Farrell's life." She said nothing. Mara. Reyes used her name with the careful deliberateness of someone deploying a tool. "He already knows you're there. He knew before I called you." She looked at the hospital entrance 2 blocks away. The helicopters were still holding position, their rotors audible even at this distance through the rain. "How?" "Because Farrell knew," Reyes said. "He requested Hartwell Regional specifically. He knew you were working there." Another beat. "He wasn't supposed to crash on that highway." But if he did, he wanted to be close to someone who could keep him alive. She let that land. I was just suspended, she said. Terminated, effectively. I know. The doctor in charge of that trauma room thinks I'm a reckless floor nurse who induced a systole in his patient. I know that too. There was something in Reyes's voice that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite its absence, the tone of a person who understood the full shape of what she was describing and considered it an operational inconvenience rather than an injustice, which was not the same thing as not caring. That's going to change in about 12 minutes. The line went dead. She sat with the phone in her hand and the engine running and the rain coming down and thought about driving. She could still drive. She had 6 weeks of savings and no employment and a suspension on her record and a vial of a classified compound that she had just administered to a man in a civilian hospital without authorization, and there was a version of the next hour in. She pulled onto the interstate and put Nashville behind her and found another city and another understaffed emergency department and started the same slow process of becoming invisible all over again. She had done it once. She knew how. She put the car in park. She got out into the rain. She was soaked through by the time she reached the hospital's main entrance. The tactical personnel had established a perimeter that allowed civilian staff to enter and exit, but created a specific invisible pressure around the building, a quality of watchfulness that most people would register only as a vague discomfort without understanding its source. One of them clocked her as she approached, tracked her for 3 steps, then looked away. She was wearing scrubs and a civilian jacket and had no badge. She walked through the entrance like she owned 12 minutes of her own time and nothing else. The lobby was different than it had been 40 minutes ago. The energy had changed the particular kind of institutional anxiety that settles over a civilian building when a military security element has taken up residence and everyone can feel the chain of command has temporarily shifted to something that operates by different rules. Reception staff were at their posts, but unnaturally still. 2 hospital administrators she recognized from occasional all-staff emails were clustered near the elevator bank, speaking in the low, rapid tones of people trying to understand a situation faster than the situation was moving. Mara walked past them to the stairs. She came out on the emergency department floor and immediately saw General Voss. He was standing at the nursing station, not behind it, not leaning on it, simply standing near it in the way of a man who was accustomed to being the fixed point around which other people organized themselves. He was in his late 50s, gray-haired and lean, with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor conditions into something that read as much older or much younger, depending on the light. His uniform bore the insignia she had been unable to read from the parking structure. She could read it now. He was looking directly at her. Not scanning, not locating. Looking, which meant he had known she was coming before she came through the door, which the tactical personnel in the lobby had reported her approach the moment they identified her. She crossed the department floor toward him. Around her, the emergency staff was doing a collective impression of people who were very focused on their work and absolutely not watching what was happening at the nursing station. She stopped 2 feet from Voss. He looked at her the way people look at things they've been trying to find for a long time and have finally found in an unexpected condition. "Nurse Solis," he said. "I'm not a nurse here anymore," she said. Effective about 40 minutes ago. Something at the edge of his expression shifted, not a smile's, but adjacent to one. "We'll address that." He glanced toward the trauma bay corridor. "How is he stable when I left the room?" His rhythm was reestablishing. "He needs continuous monitoring for the next 6 to 8 hours. The compound's metabolic clearance isn't linear, and there's a window around hour 3 where patients have presented with secondary autonomic events." She said it without effect, the way she reported clinical information, and watched him take it in with the same quality. "He needs someone in that room who knows what to watch for." "That's you," Voss said. "I was just escorted out of that room by the head of emergency medicine, Dr. Harrison Volk. Voss said the name with the neutral precision of someone reading from a file. Yes, we're going to need to speak with Dr. Volk. Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. There was a quality to the statement not threatening, nothing so crude but deliberate, the kind of deliberateness that meant the conversation with Dr. Volk was not going to be a courtesy lesson. Before she could respond, the trauma bay door opened, and Volk stepped out. He saw Mara first, and his face did the thing faces do when something that should be gone has come back, a fast sequence of reactions that settled into controlled anger. Then he registered Voss, and the anger didn't disappear, but it reconfigured, the way a fire adjusts when the wind changes direction. General. Volk's voice was careful. I was told you wanted to speak with me. I do. Voss clasped his hands behind his back. I'd like you to tell me what happened in Trauma Room 1 this morning. Volk stood a little straighter. He was not a man who was accustomed to being questioned about his own department, and he was recalibrating in real time, assessing the rank, the military presence, the tactical personnel visible through the lobby windows, and determining what posture served him best. He settled on a version of professional confidence that was slightly more brittle than his usual. A patient arrived with unstable vitals following a highway accident, Volk said. My team initiated standard trauma protocol. A staff nurse violated department policy by entering the trauma room without authorization and administering an unidentified pharmaceutical compound to the patient, inducing cardiac arrest. The patient was resuscitated. The nurse was suspended pending formal review for patient endangerment. He didn't look at Mara when he said it. That was a choice. Voss listened to all of it without expression. When Volk finished, Voss was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone formulating a response, but the silence of someone who already has the response and is deciding what order to deliver it in. The patient's name is Captain Dominic Farrell, Voss said. He is a special operations officer attached to a classified federal task force. He was deliberately poisoned with a synthetic organophosphate compound before his vehicle was forced off the interstate this morning. The compound was designed to be misread as standard trauma presentation. He paused. The sedative you were preparing to administer would have caused respiratory arrest within 4 minutes. Captain Farrell would have died in your trauma room, and it would have been logged as a complication of his injuries. Volk said nothing. The pharmaceutical compound that Nurse Solis administered, Vossa continued, is a classified military-grade nerve conduction stabilizer developed specifically for OP compound exposure in field conditions. She administered the correct agent at the correct dose using the correct timing sequence. Captain Farrell is alive because of her intervention. Another pause. If she had not intervened, we would be processing a fatality report right now instead of having this conversation. The emergency department was very quiet. The staff had stopped performing focus and were simply watching. Volk's jaw worked slightly. With respect, General, I was not informed of any of this. The patient arrived without identification, without medical history. No, Voss said. You weren't informed. That is correct. The question I'm interested in is not what you knew, Doctor. Volk, it is what you did with what you were told in the room. He looked at Mara briefly, then back at Volk. Nurse Solis told you the patient had been poisoned. She told you the mechanism. She told you what the sedative would do. She told you she had something that could counter it. He let each sentence arrive separately. And you ordered her removed from the room. Volk's face had undergone a significant transformation in the last 45 seconds. The professional confidence was still technically present, but it had lost its structural integrity. It was holding its shape the way a building holds its shape after the load-bearing wall has been quietly removed. She is a floor nurse, Volk said, and even as he said it, Mara could hear him understand that the argument was already done. She had no basis, no documented qualification to diagnose a classified military toxin or to possess an unlabeled pharmaceutical compounds. Her documented qualifications, Voss said quietly, are the reason she is alive and working in your emergency department, instead of in a file that most people in this building will never have clearance to access. He looked at Mara fully now, and something in his expression acknowledged, without sentimentality, the full distance between what she had been and where she was standing. Her name is not Mara Solis, that's accurate. It is her legal name. But you have been calling her Mouse in this department for 3 years. He said it without drama, just information. Her operational designation is Ghost. She served 7 years in a classified military combat medicine program under conditions that no one in this room, myself included, has experienced at ground level. She has kept more soldiers alive in uncontrolled field environments than most trauma surgeons see in a career. And this morning, she identified a classified neurotoxin under civilian emergency conditions and reversed it using correct protocol while being physically ordered out of the room by her supervisor. He paused. I would strongly recommend that the suspension be rescinded. Mara stood very still. She had known this moment was possible, had known it the way you know a thing you've been keeping in a locked room is still there, even when you don't open the door. The knowledge of who she had been had not gone away. She had simply built a life around not surfacing it. Hearing it spoken aloud in the emergency department of Hartwell Regional Medical Center, in front of the colleagues, who had handed her the back corner of the break room and the 2-second eye contact and the last name without the courtesy title, she had expected to feel something complicated. She felt something simpler than she anticipated. Not relief, exactly. Something more like the physical sensation of a weight being set down that you'd carried long enough, you'd stop noticing it was heavy. Volk looked at her. Whatever he had been prepared to say, he didn't say it. I need to get back to Captain Farrell's room, she said. Not to Volk, not specifically to Voss, just into the available space. If nobody objects. Nobody objected. She went. Farrell was awake. That was the first thing that surprised her, not that he had regained consciousness, but the pace of it, the degree of alertness in his eyes when she came through the door. He was propped up against the incline of the bed with an IV in each arm and a monitor cycling through his vitals. And he was watching the door with the trained watchfulness of someone whose threat assessment never fully disengages. When he saw her, something in his posture shifted, not relaxation exactly, but a specific kind of recognition. Ghost, he said. His voice was rough from the intubation attempt that had been abandoned when his heart restarted, and there was a gray quality to his skin that would take hours to resolve, but his eyes were clear. Don't, she said, moving to the monitor. Give me a minute before you talk. He gave her the minute. She ran her assessment rhythm, pressure, oxygen saturation, temperature differential between his extremities and core. The numbers were moving in the right direction, but the secondary window she'd mentioned to Voss was real, and she wanted to be in the room when it arrived. You knew I was here, she said, when she'd finished and pulled a chair to his bedside. Yes. For how long? He didn't look away from her. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there in the field, and a scar along his left jaw that was new, and he looked like someone who had been through a significant number of difficult things in the years since she'd seen him last. Psychot. Since you applied at this hospital. She sat back slightly. That's a long time to know something, and not say it. You were out, he said. You wanted out. I wasn't going to... He stopped. Reconsidered. You had a right to the quiet life. I had a quiet life, she said. I got fired from it this morning. He looked at her steadily. I'm sorry about that. Tell me about the intelligence. The shift in his expression was small, but definite, the move from personal to operational. The door that people in their line of work learn to open and close very quickly. There's a network, he said, running for at least 6 years. Government adjacent, not official, but with enough official cover that pulling on it directly creates problems. They've been moving people into positions. Hospitals, logistics, infrastructure. He paused. Hartwell Regional is one of 12 medical facilities on their list. They needed eyes inside. Someone on staff is feeding them information. The room felt very still. That's why you wanted to come here specifically, she said. The crash was supposed to give me cover for a hospital admission, long enough to confirm the contact identity from inside. But they were faster than we anticipated. They poisoned me before the vehicle went off the road, not after. His jaw tightened. I didn't expect you to be the one in the room. Nobody expects me, she said. That's been the point. He looked at her for a moment. Voss is going to want to talk to you about a role. I know what Voss is going to want, she said. Right now, I want you to rest and let the compound clear your system. We can have the other conversation when your heart rate isn't doing what it's currently doing. He almost smiled. It didn't quite form. You haven't changed. I have actually, she said, considerably. She said it without weight. It was just true. She left him with a second-year nurse named Priya, someone she trusted, which was a list she kept short, and went back to the nursing station to check the tox panel results that should be running by now. The lab had processed the standard screen, which had come back unremarkable, as she had predicted. She flagged the organophosphate addendum order and called down to confirm they were running the extended panel. She was on the phone with the lab when she heard Volk's voice in the corridor. He was talking to someone she didn't recognize, a man in a suit, not hospital administration, not clearly any affiliation she could identify. The conversation was low, and she caught only fragments. Situation is being managed, not a significant exposure. The general has no jurisdiction over internal. She could not hear the other man's responses. She kept her eyes on the lab results on the screen in front of her. When she looked up again, Volk was alone. He caught her looking and held her gaze for a moment, different from before, less certain, something working behind his eyes that she couldn't read cleanly. Then he walked away. She thought about the man in the suit. She thought about what Farrell had said. Someone on staff is feeding them information. She thought about a head of emergency medicine who had been insistent, almost urgently insistent, about managing the unknown patient himself, who had ordered the sedative with a speed that didn't quite match the clinical picture, if you knew what you were looking at. She filed the thought carefully, not a conclusion, a variable. Voss found her at the station 20 minutes later. He pulled a chair alongside her in the corridor, the particular move of someone who understands that important conversations happen in the space beside people, not in front of them, and sat down without ceremony. Federal investigators are going to be here within the hour, he said. I need you to give them everything, what you saw in the trauma room. The compound's performance, Farrell's clinical response. All of it. Yes, she said. And I need you to tell me if you saw anything else. She looked at him. He was watching her with the patience of a man who asked questions he already knew the approximate answer to, and was waiting to see how much the person in front of him had observed. Volk was talking to someone, she said, in the corridor. About 15 minutes ago. Man in a suit, no hospital identification that I could see. The conversation was short. Voss absorbed this without visible reaction. Description. She gave it. Late 40s, medium build, dark jacket, short brown hair going gray at the sides, insist. A way of standing that put his weight forward, the posture of someone accustomed to leaning in on conversations rather than receiving them. Voss took out his phone and typed something. Then it happened. The hospital lost power. Not a brief flicker, a complete, immediate cessation of all electrical systems that lasted approximately 2 seconds before the emergency generators engaged, and the backup lighting came on in the corridors, casting everything in the flat yellowish wash that made the emergency department look like a different building entirely. The monitors, on battery backup, continued functioning. The equipment that mattered stayed online. But in those 2 seconds of darkness, a door opened somewhere in the building. She heard it, rather than saw it, the specific mechanical sound of a fire door latch, releasing under controlled, deliberate pressure. Not the crash of an emergency exit being hit hard. The quiet, careful sound of someone who knew where they were going and had planned for the dark. She was already moving. She came around the corner of the corridor to Farrell's room in time to see a figure in maintenance coveralls pushing through his door. The ID badge on the coverall pocket was Hartwell Regional issued. She could see the logo, but the hands were wrong. The way he was moving was wrong. The specific angle of his body as he entered the room was the angle of someone who had an objective and was moving to complete it, not the angle of anyone responding to a facility's emergency. She didn't announce herself. She came through the door behind him at a controlled run and covered the 8 feet when completed the turn. And what happened in the next 4 seconds was something that the body does not think through when the body isn't through, when the body has been trained past the level where thinking is required. She had his right arm locked and his balance broken, and the object in his hand, a syringe already drawn on the floor before the nurse named Priya, on the other side of the bed, had finished processing what was happening. The man was larger than her by 40 pounds and significantly stronger, and none of that was relevant in the way he might have assumed it would be. She put him against the wall with his arm at an angle that gave him the choice between compliance and a broken joint, and she held him there with exactly the pressure required to maintain that choice without resolving it. "Don't," she said. He didn't. It took Voss's security personnel 11 seconds to reach the room. She counted without meaning to. When they took the man from her and she stepped back, her hands were steady. Her breathing was elevated but controlled. Pri was staring at her from the other side of Farrell's bed with an expression that Mara recognized. It was the expression people wore when they realized that the person they thought they knew was a considerably smaller fraction of the actual person than they had understood. Farrell was watching her from the bed. "Secondary window," she said to him, as if nothing else had happened. "Your heart rate is going to spike in about 20 minutes. I need you to stay calm and let it pass." He looked at the man now in the custody of Voss's personnel. He looked at the syringe on the floor. He looked at Mara. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Okay." Voss was in the doorway. His expression was the most animated she'd seen it, which meant the controlled surface had shifted by approximately 3 degrees, which on his face amounted to something significant. She crossed to him, kept her voice low. "The badge on his coverall is real. He has access credentials for this building." Voss looked at the man. "He works here?" "I don't know," she said, "but someone who does work here got him that badge." She paused. "We need to move Farrell." "Agreed." Voss was already on his radio, the conversation clipped and operational. He stepped into the corridor, and she followed, and around them, the emergency department was doing the thing it did when the situation was moving faster than the staff's ability to categorize it. Everyone working, heads down. The particular institutional focus of people who understood that something significant was happening and had made the professional decision to trust that someone else was handling the part they couldn't see. The plan took 9 minutes to execute. Farrell was moved to a military transport vehicle, staged in the ambulance bay. She'd pushed a portable monitor, 2 lines, and a medication onto the gurney, and a medication kit onto the gurney and gone with him, because his secondary window was real, and she was not leaving him in the custody of people who wouldn't recognize it when it arrived. Voss rode in the vehicle alongside them. 2 of his security personnel stayed behind at Hartwell Regional. She found out later what they stayed behind to do. At the time, she was in the back of the transport with Farrell's monitor, and her hands on his wrist, and her hands on his wrist, and her eyes on his heart rate, waiting for the spike she'd predicted. It came at minute 22, right on the timeline she'd calculated. His rate jumped to 144, and his pressure moved in the wrong direction, and for approximately 90 seconds. It was a close and careful thing, managed in the back of a moving vehicle with a portable kit and no backup beyond what she was carrying in her training. She managed it. when it passed and his numbers came back to a range she could accept. She sat back on the bench and let her shoulders drop 1 inch. Farrell had his eyes on the ceiling. "Ghost," he said. "Still not calling you that," she said. "You're stable. Try to sleep." He almost did. The transport vehicle turned off the main road and onto a secondary route she didn't recognize, heading toward a facility that Voss had described only as secure. And Mara sat in the back and watched the monitor and thought about the man in the maintenance console and the syringe on the floor and the real Hartwell Regional badge on his chest. She thought about Volk's conversation in the corridor. She thought about Farrell's words, someone on staff is feeding them information, and the 12 hospitals on the networks list, and the specific personal insistence with which a head of emergency medicine had removed her from a trauma room and reached for a sedative that would have killed his patient cleanly and without apparent cause. The transport slowed as they approached a gate. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize, not Reyes, a different format, and the message was 4 words. "They know you moved him." She looked at the message for a long moment. Then she looked at the gate ahead of them, and the facility beyond it, and the armed personnel positioned at the perimeter. And then the first shot cracked against the transport vehicle's exterior panel, and everything that came next happened very fast. The shot hit the rear panel on the driver's side with a sound like a hammer striking sheet. Metal, sharp, immediate, nothing like the movies, and before the echo finished, Voss had his radio up, and Mara had her hand flat on Farrell's chest, pushing him down against the gurney. "Stay flat," she said. Not a request. Farrell didn't argue. His monitor was still running rate at 91. Pressure holding in a range, she kept one hand on the side rail and her body low as the vehicle lurched hard to the left. The driver was taking evasive action, which meant the driver had a protocol for this, which meant this kind of thing had been anticipated as a possibility even if nobody had told her that explicitly. She filed that away. 2 vehicles, one of Voss's personnel said from the front, his voice carrying the clipped, stripped-down quality of someone transmitting information rather than reacting to it. "Closing from the east. Gate is compromised. Repeat, gate personnel are down." Voss had his weapon out. She hadn't seen him draw it. "Rerouting to secondary," he said into the radio. "Authorization, Voss 79er. Move now." The transport vehicle swung hard right and accelerated in a direction that was not toward the facility gate. Through the small reinforced window in the rear door, Mara could see headlights, 2 sets, moving fast, maintaining distance, with the practiced patience of pursuit vehicles that were not trying to close immediately. They were herding, keeping the transport on a specific vector. "They're pushing us toward Caldwell Road," the driver said. "That route dead ends at the rail corridor." "I know," Voss said. "Don't take it." "Sir, the alternatives. Find one." She tuned out the navigation problem and turned to what she could control, which was the man on the gurney in front of her. Farrell's secondary window had passed, but he was still in a fragile stabilization. The compound's clearance was not linear, and the physiological stress of a vehicle pursuit and the noise and the movement was the worst possible environment for a patient whose autonomic system was still recalibrating. His heart rate was climbing. Not dangerously, not yet, but in the direction of not good. "Look at me," she said. He did. "I need your rate to come down. That means I need you to breathe on my count." She held his gaze. "And for 4, don't think about what's outside. There are people shooting at us," he said. "Yes, 4 counts in." She put 2 fingers on his wrist, where she could feel his pulse directly, not filtered through the monitor. "Now." He breathed. She counted. It was the most absurd clinical intervention she had performed in her career, which was a career that had included performing a field surgical procedure in the back of a moving vehicle in a different country under completely different circumstances, and it was not more absurd than that had been. His rate came down from 108 to 93 over approximately 90 seconds. Not perfect, but workable. A second impact hit the transport, not a gunshot, a vehicle. Something had tapped the rear corner hard enough to make the whole frame shudder and knock her sideways into the equipment rack. She caught herself on the rail and nothing came off the shelf, and she ran a fast check, both IV lines intact, monitor running, Farrell's face taut but controlled. That was close contact, Voss said from the front. They're moving to pit. She understood what that meant. A pit maneuver at this speed would roll the vehicle. A rolled transport with an unstable patient and unrestrained equipment would produce a casualty list before anyone outside fired another shot. How far to the secondary location, she asked. 6 minutes, Voss said. He doesn't have 6 minutes of this. His autonomic system can't handle sustained physical stress at this volume. If his rate goes above 130 again. 4 minutes, Voss said to the driver. Not a suggestion. The driver pushed the vehicle hard. She braced against the equipment rack with her feet spread and one hand on the gurney rail and one on Farrell's arm, and she felt the transport accelerate through a turn that was at the absolute edge of what a vehicle size could manage without losing the rear end. And then they were on a different road surface, smoother, wider, and the sound of the pursuing vehicles changed pitch as they fell back. Gate 2 is open, someone said on the radio. You're clear. The transport slowed, then stopped. She let herself breathe. The facility was not what she had expected, which meant she had been wrong about what kind of operation Voss was running, which she noted as information. It was a converted industrial building, the kind of structure that appears on zoning maps as a logistics warehouse and is unremarkable enough that it disappears from conscious attention. Inside, it was something else entirely, a mobile command infrastructure that had been assembled with military efficiency, full medical bay, communications arrays, personnel who moved with the organized purpose of a unit that had been operational for long enough to have stopped wasting motion. She moved Farrell from the transport to the medical bay. Voss's play, with 2 of Voss's personnel assisting, got him transferred to a proper bed with a full monitoring suite and spent 15 minutes running a comprehensive reassessment. The pursuit had cost him. His numbers were worse than they'd been before the shooting started, the stress having pushed his compromised autonomic system backward. But worse was not critical, and she had what she needed to manage it. She hung a second agent alongside his existing IVA vasopressor at a dose she calculated against his current pressure readings and stood at the bedside watching the monitor cycle through its numbers with the focused patience of someone who has learned that some clinical situations cannot be hurried. A man she hadn't seen before appeared at the bay entrance. Late 40s, civilian clothing, the particular watchfulness of federal intelligence rather than military. He looked at Farrell. He looked at Mara. He said, "To no one specifically. She's the one from the hospital?" "Yes," Voss said from behind him. "Okay." He looked at her again. "When he's stable enough to be debriefed." 2 hours, she said without turning from the monitor. Minimum. He accepted this without argument, which told her something about the actual power structure in the room. His name, she found out later, was Agent Decker. Federal Task Force, the same one Farrell was attached to, operating out of a joint office that existed in the organizational chart somewhere between 3 agencies and reported to none of them cleanly. The kind of structure that got built when a problem was too politically complicated for any single agency to own. She had time to learn these things because Farrell slept, finally, his body making the decision that consciousness was a luxury it could temporarily suspend. His numbers stabilized over the next 90 minutes into a range she was willing to call managed, if not safe. And she used the time to drink 2 cups of bad coffee and sit in a folding chair by his bed and think about Harrison Volk. She thought about the man in the maintenance coverall and the real badge on his chest. She thought about the conversation in the corridor, Volk's voice, low and deliberate, the words she had caught. The situation is being managed. That was a specific phrase. Not the situation is under control, the language of someone reassuring a colleague. being managed the language of someone reporting to a principal. She thought about the 12 hospitals on the network's list. She thought about a head of emergency medicine who had inserted himself personally into the management of an unidentified patient who had moved to sedate that patient with a speed that didn't fit the clinical picture, and who had been furious, not professionally concerned, genuinely furious when she had intervened. She was thinking about this when Voss came into the bay and sat down across from her. "The man from the hospital," he said. "The one in the coverall. He's talking." She looked up from her coffee. His access credentials came from Hartwell Regional's facilities management system. Someone with administrative access to that system generated a badge for him 3 days ago. Voss paused. "We're running the access log now." She waited. "There are 14 irregular badge generations in the system over the last 8 months, he said, all originating from a single administrator-level login. He paused again. The pause had weight. That login belongs to Dr. Harrison Volk. She set her coffee down. She had suspected it. She had filed it as a variable rather than a conclusion because she understood the difference. Because she understood the difference, did not draw conclusions from incomplete data, even when the pattern was suggestive. But hearing it confirmed was a different thing from suspecting it. There was a particular quality to the moment of confirmation, not satisfaction, not surprise, something more complicated than either. "How long?" she asked. "We think at least 2 years, Voss said. Possibly longer. He has access to patient records, admission data, staffing schedules, medication, procurement. Everything a network that was trying to place assets and manage outcomes inside a medical facility would need." She sat with that. "He tried to kill Farrell," she said. Not a question. He had the opportunity and the method. The sedative would have been logged as a clinical decision in a high-stress trauma situation. No one would have questioned it. He looked at her steadily. "No one except you." She thought about the 3 years. The back corner of the break room, the last name address, the 2-second eye contact, the slow and consistent diminishment that she had accepted as the cost of staying invisible. She thought about all the things she had swallowed and set aside in the name of not surfacing what she was, and how that restraint had, this morning, been the specific thing that made her useful to someone who needed to die in a trauma room and didn't. She didn't say any of that. "What happens now?" she asked. "Federal investigators are at the hospital," Voss said. "They're pulling Volk's financial records, communication logs, the badge access data." He paused. "He doesn't know yet what we have. He's still at Hartwell Regional. He gave a statement to hospital administration about this morning's events, characterized you as a rogue employee with erratic behavior who may have had prior access to controlled substances." "Of course he did," she said. "He's given an interview to a local news outlet," Voss said. "It aired 20 minutes ago." She looked at him. "He describes the situation as a staffing incident. A nurse with an unclear background who administered an unidentified compound to a patient and caused cardiac arrest before being removed from the hospital. He does not name you, but the description is specific enough." She was quiet for a moment. "He's controlling the story while he still can." "Yes," Voss said. "He knows something is wrong, the military presence, the investigators. He doesn't know the full scope yet. He's buying time." She stood up, checked Farrell's monitor stable as she could want, and set her coffee cup on the equipment tray. "Then we need to move faster than he is." Voss almost smiled. Again, the 3-degree version. The next 4 hours were the kind of organized chaos that she had not experienced since leaving the program, the specific texture of a multi-agency operations, accelerating, sexing toward a point of commitment, with all the friction and coordination failures, and moments of genuine competence that characterized real operational work rather than the clean, linear version that exists only in after-action reports. Decker's team was pulling financial data. Voss's personnel were coordinating with federal investigators still on site at Hartwell Regional. A signals analyst she met briefly, and whose name she didn't catch, was working through Volk's communication records, looking for the upstream contact in the Black Ridge network, because that was what it was called. She learned, sitting in on a debrief she was not technically supposed to be in, but that nobody asked her to leave. Black Ridge Strategic, a private entity that had been operating in the space between legitimate government contracting and something considerably less legitimate for approximately 6 years. Not a shadow government, something more diffuse than that, and in some ways more dangerous because of the diffusion. A network of individuals in positions of institutional trust who had agreed, for varying combinations of financial and ideological reasons, to share information and occasionally to manage outcomes. Medical facilities were useful to them because medical facilities processed people who were sometimes inconvenient to powerful interests, and a well-placed individual in an emergency department could ensure that certain people received the wrong treatment at the wrong time, and that the record reflected nothing anomalous. 12 hospitals. Volk was one of 14 identified insiders across the network. She listened to this in a folding chair in a converted warehouse outside Nashville and thought about what it meant to have spent 3 years invisible in a building that had been, without her knowledge, a node in something like this. She went back to Farrell when the debrief ended. He was awake. Fully this time, the residual fog from the compound's metabolic clearance had lifted enough that his eyes were clear and present and tracking her the way they had tracked things in the field, with that quality of sustained attention that had been trained into him by the same program that had trained it into her. Dixon, how much did you hear? He asked. Enough. She sat down. You knew about Volk. We suspected, he said. We didn't have confirmation until the badge access data. He paused. We needed an insider contact at the hospital to confirm it. That was what the admission was for, before everything went wrong. You were going to be the patient and identify the contact from inside. Yes, and you chose Hartwell Regional because I was there. He met her eyes. You were the variable I could trust. If anything went wrong medically, he stopped. I knew what you were capable of. She looked at him for a moment. You used me as a safety net, without telling me. Yes, he said. He didn't dress it up. She appreciated that in the specific way she appreciated things that were honest, even when they were uncomfortable. Oh, right, she said, Mara. He used her name the way Reyes had deliberately as a tool, but with something else underneath it. I'm sorry it cost you the job. It wasn't really my job, she said. I was just occupying it. She stood up. Get some sleep. You have a debrief in 4 hours, and your pressure is still 20 points lower than I want it. She left the bay and walked down the facility's main corridor and found an empty supply room and stood in it for approximately 3 minutes, with the door closed and her back against the shelving and her eyes shut. Not because she was falling apart, she wasn't. Not in any way she couldn't manage. But because 3 minutes of unwitnessed stillness was a resource she had learned to take when it was available. The way soldiers sleep when the opportunity presents, regardless of how long the sleep is. She thought about Volk in front of a camera. She thought about the 17 employees he had passed in the corridor this morning, each of whom had heard his version of events before anyone else's. She thought about the news clip and how many people had seen it, and how many of them had formed a picture of a reckless, unstable nurse with an unclear background and access to uncontrolled substances. She thought about Mouse. She had never actually heard anyone call her that, but she had known they did. You always knew. She opened her eyes. She went back to work. At hour 6, Voss found her recalibrating Farrell's vasopressor drip and told her that the financial data had produced something concrete. 3 wire transfers over 14 months, originating from a shell entity registered in a state she didn't need to know the name of, arriving in an account connected to Harrison Volk through 2 intermediary LLCs. The total was significant enough to tell a story on its own. Combined with the badge access data, the communication logs, which had produced 3 encrypted messages that had been cracked in the last 2 hours, and the testimony of the man from the maintenance coverall, the federal investigators at Hartwell Regional had what they needed for an arrest warrant. "When?" she asked. "Tonight," Voss said, "unless he runs." "He won't run," she said. "He thinks he's still managing the story." She was right. At 8:47 that evening, Harrison Volk was in his office at Hartwell Regional Medical Center, reviewing the statement he planned to release to the hospital board in the morning, a document he had spent considerable time constructing, when federal agents knocked on his door with a warrant that covered conspiracy, attempted murder, and a third charge related to his participation in the Black Ridge Network. She was not there for it. She was in the medical bay when it happened, and she heard about it from Decker 20 minutes later. She heard about it, and she sat with it for a moment, and then she went back to Farrell's monitor. His pressure was up to 96/62. Better. Not where she wanted it, but moving. "You should sleep," he said from the bed. "Your pressure's still low, Mara." He said her name quietly. "You've been awake for 16 hours. Your hands are going to start making errors." She looked at her hands. They were steady. But he wasn't wrong about the hours. "Sit down at least," he said. She sat. Outside the facility, the night had closed in fully over Nashville, and the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets dark and washed and temporarily quiet. Inside the converted warehouse, the operation continued its mechanical momentum data analysts, federal coordinators, Voss's personnel, cycling through shift changes with the practiced efficiency of a unit that understood sustained operations. The world outside did not know what was happening inside this building, or what had happened in Hartwell Regional's trauma room that morning, or what a floor nurse named Mouse had done with a vial from her scrub pocket. She sat in a folding chair by Dominic Farrell's bed and watched his monitor and felt the specific weight of sustained wakefulness pressing behind her eyes. She was almost asleep when Decker came to the bay door. The expression on his face was not the expression of someone delivering good news. "We have a problem," he said. She was on her feet before the sentence finished. "Volk made a call before they got to him," Decker said. 40 minutes before arrest. We flagged it after the fact, the number connected to a Black Ridge operational contact. The call lasted 11 seconds. She waited. "Our security perimeter here was established 6 hours ago," he said. The location was classified, compartmentalized. He stopped. Someone gave it to them. The lights went out. Not the backup power this time, all of it. The emergency generators, the battery systems, the communications arrays, everything cut simultaneously in the precise coordinated way of a targeted infrastructure attack rather than a power failure. In the pure dark, she heard Farrell pull himself upright on the bed. She heard from somewhere beyond the facility's north wall the sound of vehicles. Then the first explosion shook the building's eastern face hard enough to crack the concrete wall beside the supply corridor and knock equipment from shelves and bring a section of ceiling tile down in. A white cascade directly over the medical bay door. And in the ringing silence that followed, with smells of cordite and dust filling the dark room, Mara Solis stood at the center of it and felt something settle in her chest that was not fear and was not calm, but was something older than either the particular quality of a person who has arrived at the moment where everything they've been. Holding back is exactly what's needed, and who understands without any drama about it that there is no longer any point in holding it back. "Stay on the bed," she said to Farrell, in the dark, in a voice that had no relationship to the woman who had stood in the back corner of a break room for 3 years. "And don't move until I tell you." She moved toward the door. The second explosion hit the north wall. The second explosion hit closer than the first. She felt it in her sternum before she heard it, a concussive pressure wave that traveled through the facility's concrete floor and up through the soles of her shoes and into her chest cavity in the half-second before the sound arrived. Dust came off the ceiling in a curtain. Something structural in the north corridor made a sound like a large bone breaking, a deep crack that propagated through the wall and went quiet in a way that wasn't reassuring. She was already through the medical bay door. The corridor was completely dark, not the darkness of a room with the lights off, but the darkness of a space with no ambient light source at all, no exit signs, no equipment indicators, nothing. Her eyes adjusted in the first 4 seconds to the level they were going to adjust. Was not enough to navigate by sight. She put her left hand on the wall and moved. She had walked this corridor 6 times since arriving at the facility. 6 times was enough. She counted doorways by fuel supply room, communications alcove, the double doors to the main operations floor, and when she reached the operations floor, she stopped because the sounds coming from beyond the facility's exterior walls had changed. Less percussion now, more movement, engines, boots on exterior gravel. The specific acoustic signature of personnel advancing on a fixed position. Someone was at her elbow. She almost moved before she recognized Decker's breathing pattern, fast but controlled, the rhythm of someone managing adrenaline rather than surrendering to it. Minimum 6 personnel, he said, very low. East and north approaches. They're not trying to breach fast, they're establishing containment first. How many of your people are mobile? She asked. 4. 2 are down from the first blast northeast corner of the ops floor. I've got medics. Where are your medics? Solis. Where? South corridor. But we need... She was already moving toward the south corridor. She found them in 30 seconds too of Voss's personnel, working by the light of a tactical flashlight on a man she recognized as part of the communications team. He had caught a piece of wall material from the first explosion, and the wound on his left thigh was significant, the kind of blood loss that had a timeline attached to it, and the timeline was not generous. The medic working on him, professionally, the medic working on him was competent. She could see that immediately from the tourniquet placement and the pressure dressing, but competent and sufficient were not the same thing in this particular situation. She knelt beside them. "Give me the light," she said. The medic looked at her. "I'm a trauma nurse. Give me the light and keep that pressure on." He gave her the light. She assessed in 45 seconds tourniquet was correctly placed but too loose by approximately 20% of necessary tension, which meant the blood loss was slower than it should have been, but not stopped. She tightened it 1 full rotation, felt the resistance change, watched the bleeding at the wound edge slow to a rate she could accept. "He needs a second line," she said. "Do you have IV access in your kit?" "Yes. 18 gauge, forearm left side. Wide open." "Do you have saline?" 1 liter. Run it." She stood. "He stays flat, feet elevated, if you can manage it with whatever's in here. Don't move him until the shooting stops. And if it doesn't stop?" She didn't answer that because it wasn't a question with a useful answer, and they both understood it. She went back to the operations floor. Voss was there. She couldn't see him, but she knew his voice, and he was on a radio that apparently still had battery power, talking in the compressed language of someone coordinating a defensive response with limited assets. She moved toward his voice, and when she was close enough, he registered another presence she recognized without looking at the qualities she recognized from people trained in the same system, the peripheral awareness that operates below the threshold of conscious attention. "South approach is still clear," he said to her, and into the radio simultaneously. "We're moving Farrell in 4 minutes. His lines are still running," she said. "If you pull the IVs before the vasopressor has..." "We don't have 4 minutes," he said. "We have 4 minutes before they complete the containment ring. After that, we have 0 minutes." He paused. "Can he walk?" She thought about Farrell's pressure, reading 90 minutes ago. 96/62. Low, functional, but the kind of low that made extended physical exertion a legitimate clinical risk. "For how long?" she asked. 200 meters to the secondary vehicle. "He can walk 200 meters. she said. Slowly. Not slowly, Voss said. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Then yes, with someone on his left side. That's you. I know. She went back to the medical bay. Farrell was already sitting upright. He had heard the conversation, or enough of it, and he was doing the assessment on himself that she would have done, testing his weight on his feet, gauging the room's tilt, deciding what his body was capable of, regardless of what his body would prefer. He was wearing a hospital gown, and his face in the tactical flashlight that someone had left in the bay was the color of old concrete, but his eyes were doing the thing they did. IVs come out, she said. I'll cap the line and we move. How bad is it outside? Bad enough that we're moving. She pulled the vasopressor line, capped it with practiced hands, taped it flat against his forearm. Left the saline line running. It would run dry in 20 minutes, but it was better than nothing. Can you get your feet over the side? He did. Slower than he wanted to. She could see the effort in the set of his jaw, but he did it without assistance and stood without swaying, which was more than she had cautiously expected. Left side, she said. She put her right arm behind his back, his left arm over her shoulders, and they moved. The south corridor was 60 feet long. In a building with power and stable footing, it was nothing. In complete darkness, with a patient whose blood pressure was 20 points below optimal over a floor, that the second explosion had shifted enough to create 2 distinct ridges of buckled concrete in the first 20 feet. It was an exercise in controlled problem solving. She navigated by the same wall contact method, counting her steps, keeping her weight available to support his without making the support feel like handling. He was not a man who responded well to being handled. She had understood that about him from the first conversation in the trauma bay, and she worked with it. They made the south exit in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The air outside was cold and smelled of smoke and wet ground, and the darkness outside the building was a different quality than the darkness inside, less absolute. The sky overhead carrying some ambient light from the city's distant glow that gave the landscape a faint blue-gray definition. She could see the secondary vehicle, a civilian SUV, dark-colored, unremarkable, parked 80 meters away, across what had been a maintenance lot. She could also see, at the edge of her vision, to the northeast, 2 tactical lights moving at the perimeter. They were sweeping methodically. Not at the south face yet. Not yet. Move, Voss said from behind her. He had materialized from the exit behind them, with 2 of his personnel flanking. They moved. The 80 meters felt considerably longer than 80 meters. Farrell was working hard. She could feel the effort in his breathing, the irregular quality of it, the way his weight shifted toward her on the uneven ground in a pattern that told her his blood pressure was doing something she couldn't currently measure and would not enjoy measuring. If she could. She kept moving. He kept moving. He kept foot, then another, on ground that was gravel in some places, and mud in others, and twice a concrete pad that offered enough solid footing that she let herself pick up the pace. A shout came from the northeast perimeter. Then a light swung toward them. Don't run, Voss said. Walk faster. She did not run. She walked faster. The SUV was 30 meters away, then 20. Then the door was open, and she was getting Farrell into the back seat with a hand on his head and a hand on his arm, and she was in behind him before the first shot from the perimeter hit the vehicle's rear quarter panel with a sound she was starting to recognize with a familiarity she hadn't asked for. The driver did not wait. The SUV did not. At SUE, came out of the maintenance, lit his sense speed, pressed back against the seat, and made Farrell grip the door handle with whitening knuckles. And she got her fingers on his wrist and counted his pulse by feel in the dark of the moving vehicle. And the number she got was fast but present, and she held it as her primary data point and breathed against it. They drove for 22 minutes without speaking. When this SUV stopped, they were in a parking structure in a part of the city she didn't recognize, and a second vehicle was waiting. The transfer took 3 minutes. By the time she had Farrell settled in the new vehicle with a blood pressure reading from a portable cuff, 88/58. Lower than she wanted, but not yet in the territory that required immediate intervention. The facility they had left was, according to what Voss said into his radio in the front seat, fully breached. Blackridge had taken the building. But Blackridge had taken an empty building. She sat with that for a moment, felt the specific, complicated quality of it, the near thing, the thing that had almost been different. She checked Farrell's pressure again. 15 minutes later, 91/61, moving in the right direction. She let herself unclench something in her hands that she hadn't consciously clenched. "You're going to be all right," she said. "I know," he said. His voice had the rough, stripped quality of exhaustion. "You keep telling me that. You keep needing to hear it." He almost laughed. It came out as something quieter. "Mara." He said her name with the careful weight of someone who is about to say something they have thought about for a long time. When this is over, she said, "you're going to sleep for approximately 16 hours, and then you're going to do a full debrief, and then we're going to have whatever conversation you're building up to." She kept her eyes on the portable monitor. "Not before." "Okay," he said. He slept 20 minutes later. She did not. The new safe location was a federal building, properly federal this time. Visible insignia, uniformed personnel, the kind of institutional security that operated by rules that included paper trails and oversight. She found this reassuring in a way she hadn't expected to. Decker met them in the underground entrance and looked at Farrell and then at her and said, "You both look terrible," which she accepted as accurate. They got Farrell into a proper medical suite with a proper monitoring setup and a physician she actually trusted to manage the overnight watch, a military doctor named Vasquez, who had enough field experience that she didn't have to. Explain the compound's clearance timeline from scratch. She briefed Vasquez for 20 minutes, handed over her notes, and was in the middle of explaining the secondary autonomic window when Decker appeared at the suite door and said he needed her. She held up one finger, finished the briefing, then followed Decker into the corridor. "They found something in Volk's files," he said, walking. "Something beyond the financial transfers and the badge records." She followed him to a conference room where two analysts were working at laptops, and Voss was standing at the head of the table, looking at a document on a screen. "Sit down," Voss said. She sat. "Volk has been maintaining records," Voss said. "Detailed records. Patient outcomes, admission data, medication logs." Across 14 months, he turned the screen toward her. He has been tracking which interventions produced which results on specific individuals. Individuals who appear on a list that Blackridge provided. She looked at the screen. The document was formatted like a clinical outcomes log: dates, case numbers, medications administered, results. The results column used clinical language. Adverse outcome. Procedure complication, natural deterioration. Clean, neutral, professionally appropriate language that meant something entirely different when you understood what you were reading. "How many?" she asked. "Confirmed 4," Decker said from the doorway. "Possible. 9 more." She looked at the screen for a long moment. She thought about the men and women represented by those case numbers, and their families, and the people who had been told that a loved one had experienced a procedure complication or a natural deterioration, and she thought about Harrison Volk reviewing those outcomes in his office and filing them under the correct column. She pushed the screen back. "His press statement this morning," she said. "The interview. How widely did it run?" "Local affiliates picked it up," Voss said. "Online it's been shared significantly. His framing the reckless nurse, the unidentified compound, the induced cardiac arrest. It's the version most people who followed the story today have." "I want to be in that room when you show him what you have," she said. Voss studied her. "That's not standard." "I know it's not standard," she said. "I'm not asking as a standard thing." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Harrison Volk was in a federal holding room 2 floors below. He had been there for 4 hours. He had a lawyer, a good one, the kind of lawyer that people retain before they need lawyers, which was itself a piece of information, and he had said nothing of substance since his arrest. He was dressed in the clothes he had been wearing at the hospital, minus his white coat, and he looked like a man who was managing a situation rather than a man who believed the situation was unmanageable. That quality, the managerial composure, the sense that he was still operating from a position of some control, was intact when Voss and Decker entered the room with 2 federal investigators, and Mara came in last and sat against the wall where he could see her. He looked at her. Something in his expression moved. "Dr. Volk," Voss said, sitting across from him, "we're going to go through some documents with you. Your attorney has copies." The lawyer, a lean, careful man who had clearly been in rooms like this before, looked at the folders being placed on the table with professional wariness. Volk looked at Mara. She looked back. She didn't perform anything with her face. She just looked at him the way she had looked at him in the trauma room this morning, with the specific level quality of someone who was not going to be managed. "The wire transfer records," Voss said, opening the first folder. 3 transactions, 14 months. Originating entity is registered as a logistics consulting firm. The beneficial owner of that firm connects to Blackridge Strategic through 2 intermediate holding companies. The destination account connects to you through a similar structure. He set the document in front of Volk. "This one we have completely." Volk's lawyer put his hand on his client's arm. Volk looked at the document and said nothing. "The badge access records," Decker said, sliding the second folder across. 14 irregular credential generations from your administrator login over 8 months. The individual apprehended at Hartwell Regional this morning has provided a statement in perpetuation confirming that the badge he carried was provided through a contact at the hospital. He has identified that contact. He paused. He identified you. The composure held. But she could see its edges now, the specific quality of held composure under sustained pressure, the way it becomes visible, precisely because it is being maintained rather than simply existing. "The outcomes log," Voss said. He placed the third folder. This one landed differently. She watched Volk look at it and understood from the micro-movement in his face something in the area around his eyes, a tightening that he couldn't completely suppress, that he had not expected them to have this. He had expected the financial records, possibly. He had anticipated the badge issue. But the outcomes log was something he had kept in a system he believed was secure, in a format that had no obvious connection to anything actionable, and the fact that it was in a federal folder on a table in front of him reorganized the geometry of his situation in a way the composure could not fully absorb. 4 confirmed, Voss said. 9 additional cases under review. Volk's lawyer said quietly, "I need a moment with my client." "You have it," Voss said. He stood. Decker stood. Mara stood last. She looked at Volk one more time before she left the room. Was looking at the outcomes log. His hands were flat on the table. The composure was still there technically, structurally, but it had the quality of something that was being held together from the inside by effort rather than by any inherent integrity. She walked out. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Voss stood beside her and didn't speak, which she appreciated. "The morning interview," she said. "Is there any way to minus—" "The federal investigators are issuing a statement in the morning," Voss said. "It will include the confirmed charges, the badge access evidence, and the financial records. It will also include a full account of what happened in the trauma room and what the compound was and why it was necessary." He paused. "Your name will be in it, your operational background, to the extent it can be disclosed." "To the extent," she said. "Some things remain classified," he said. "But enough." She nodded. Enough was a word she had made her peace with in a different context years ago, and it served adequately here. She was walking back toward the medical suite to check on Farrell when her phone buzzed. The number was Reyes, she answered. Blackridge's upstream leadership, Reyes said without preamble. We've had a name for 6 hours. It's confirmed now from 3 separate sources. A pause. Are you somewhere you can hear this? Yes, she said. He said the name. She stopped walking. The name belonged to a person she had not heard mentioned once in the last 18 hours of operational briefings, debriefs, data analysis, and conversation. Not by Decker. Not by Voss. Not in the outcomes log. Not in the financial records. Not in any of the documents she had seen laid on that table in the holding room. The name belonged to a person who had been, to all appearances, entirely absent from the Blackridge picture. The name belonged to the head of the federal task force that had been investigating Blackridge for the last 2 years. The task force that Decker worked for. She stood in the corridor of a federal building, surrounded by personnel who reported up a chain of command that ended at a name that had just been handed to her as the operational head of the network they were supposed to be dismantling. And she thought about the 11-second call that Volk had made before his arrest. And she thought about the facility's location being compromised 6 hours after it was supposedly established. And she thought about Decker's expression in the room when the financial records were placed on the table watching Volk rather than the documents, his attention on the wrong thing. She thought about the text message on the vehicle. They know you moved him. 4 words that had arrived on a number she didn't recognize and had never traced because everything happened too fast. She had one asset in this building she trusted completely. She turned and walked back to the medical suite at a pace that was not running. Vasquez was at the monitoring station when she came through the door. Farrell was asleep. His pressure on the monitor read 94/63 better, meaningfully better, the curve of the night moving in the right direction. She crossed to Vasquez and spoke directly into her ear. I need you to listen to me very carefully, she said, low, and I need you to not react to what I'm about to say. Vasquez went still in the way of someone who has heard that sentence before, under conditions that required the instruction to be taken seriously. Farrell needs to be moved again, Mara said. In the next 15 minutes, without Decker knowing. Vasquez looked at Farrell's monitor. She looked at Mara. She was making the calculation, the clinical risk of another move against whatever Mara's face was telling her about the alternative. His pressure. Vasquez started. I know, Mara said. We manage it on the move. She held Vasquez's gaze. I wouldn't ask if there was another option. Vasquez was quiet for 3 seconds. Okay, she said. Mara went to Farrell's bedside and put her hand on his shoulder and shook once, gently. His eyes opened immediately, the reflex of someone who had spent years sleeping light. We're moving, she said. He looked at her face. Now, he said. Right now. He didn't ask why. He had known her long enough to know that if she said right now in that particular tone, the reason would become clear shortly, and arguing about it would cost time they didn't have. She was disconnecting his monitor leads when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the suite, not the casual footsteps of personnel going about their work, but the deliberate footsteps of someone moving toward a specific destination with a specific purpose, and the footsteps were not alone. She counted 4 sets. The suite had 1 door. She looked at Vasquez. Vasquez looked at the door. Farrell had his feet over the side of the bed. The handle moved. The handle turned. Mara made the decision in the time it took the door to open 3 inches, not a panicked decision, not a calculated one, something faster than either. She crossed the 4 feet to the supply cabinet on the suite's east wall, pulled it open, and had Vasquez's crash kit bag off the lower shelf and in her hand before the first figure came through the door. There were 3 of them. Not 4, she had miscounted the footsteps in the corridor, or one had stayed outside, which was worse because it meant the exit was covered. They were in federal building credentials and civilian clothing, the specific combination that had been unremarkable to her an hour ago and was entirely different now. The first one through looked at Farrell on the bed, and then at Mara, and then at Vasquez, and his hand moved toward his jacket. Mara threw the crash kit bag, nodded him past him at the doorframe, hard enough to make a significant sound and draw his eyes for the half second she needed. She covered the distance while his attention was fragmented, got inside his reach, and did the thing she had done in Farrell's hospital room 14 hours ago, but faster, this time, with less hesitation, because the body retains what it practices, and she had been practicing this particular set of responses since she was 22 years old in a program that nobody at Hartwell Regional had known existed. He went down. Not unconscious, she didn't need unconscious. She needed time. The second man was faster. He had his weapon clear of his jacket by the time she turned, and she was calculating the geometry of the room. Farrell behind her, Vasquez to the left, 2 meters of open floor between her and the gun when Farrell moved. He came off the bed with the particular quality of a man running on something beyond his current physiology. The reserve that the body produces when the alternative is unacceptable. He was still in a hospital gown with an IV line capped on his forearm, and his blood pressure was medically insufficient for this kind of exertion, and none of that mattered because he hit the second man from the side at a trajectory that hadn't been anticipated, and the weapon discharged into the ceiling, a single shot that was very loud in the enclosed space and brought plaster dust down on all of them. The third man grabbed Vasquez. She heard Vasquez make a short, sharp sound, not a scream, a tactical vocalization, the kind that comes out of people who know that being grabbed from behind has a specific physical solution if you respond in the first 2 seconds before the hold is established. Vasquez did not know that solution. She was a military physician, trained and competent, and this was not her domain. Mara made the 3 steps across the room, and the third man released Vasquez and redirected to Mara, and she let him redirect, because redirecting to her was correct. She was the problem in this room. She was the one who understood what was happening and why, and getting him to commit his attention to her was the most useful thing anyone in the room could do right now. What followed was not clean. It was not efficient in the way of a training demonstration. He was larger than her, faster than the first man, and he had training, real training, not security theater. She took a hit to her left shoulder that sent a bright spike of pain down to her elbow and made that arm go briefly unreliable. And she worked around it the way she had learned work around damage in situations where stopping to acknowledge it was not available. She got him against the equipment rack with enough force that something expensive sounding broke behind him. And then Farrell was there still on his feet, barely, the gray in his face now, the color of old ash, with the second man's weapon. And the third man looked at the gun and made the reasonable choice. The whole thing took 41 seconds. Her shoulder was sending signals she was going to have to pay attention to shortly. Farrell was holding himself upright against the wall, with one hand flat on the surface, and his breathing was the breathing of someone whose cardiovascular system was registering a formal complaint about the last 40 seconds. Vasquez was checking her own forearm, where the third man had grabbed her and would have a bruise by morning. Okay, Mara said, to no one specifically, and all of them generally. Farrell looked at her. You're holding your arm wrong. I know, she said. Can you stand without the wall? He pushed off the wall and stood, swayed once, steadied. Yes. Vasquez, we need restraints, and we need them in the next 60 seconds, and then we need a different exit from this building than the one I came in through. Vasquez was already moving. She used zip ties from the crash kit on all 3 men's wrists, ankles, the professional application of someone who had done this before in conditions she was not going to describe, and then she took the weapon Farrell was holding and looked at him and said, "Can you actually shoot that accurately right now?" "Probably not," he said honestly. "Then give it to me." He did. Vasquez found them a service elevator that opened onto a loading dock on the building's west face. They used it. The loading dock had a security camera that Mara disabled with 30 seconds of attention to its mounting bracket and wiring, and then they were outside in the pre-dawn cold of a Nashville morning, the sky beginning its shift from black to the deep gray blue that preceded actual dawn. And she had a man with suboptimal blood pressure, a physician with a bruising forearm, and a weapon she was not licensed to carry in civilian life. She called Reyes. "I need extraction," she said. "West loading dock. The building is compromised from the inside. I need someone who isn't connected to Decker's chain of command." A pause. How compromised his direct supervisory structure leads to Blackridge. The pause was longer this time. "Give me 8 minutes." "Make it 6, she said. She looked at Farrell. He was leaning against the dock's concrete wall with his eyes open and the set of his jaw telling her he was managing something considerable. His pressure is dropping. 5 minutes, Reyes said. "Don't move." She sat Farrell down on the dock's edge with his legs hanging and took his pulse with her fingers, 94, irregular, and looked at the capped IV line on his forearm and made the calculation that she had been making all night. The continuous rolling assessment of what his body needed against what was available to give it. "Talk to me," she said, "about something that isn't this." He looked at her sideways. "Seriously? Your heart rate is doing something I don't love, and I need it to come down. Talk." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I had a dog. Before all of this, a shepherd mix named Hector. I gave him to my sister when I was deployed the second time, and she kept..." He paused. "She sends me pictures sometimes. He's fat now." "Good," she said. His pulse was coming down marginally. "What's your sister's name?" "Diane. She's a third-grade teacher in Ohio, and she has never once in her life done anything more dangerous than a heated argument with a school board, and I have always considered her the smarter of the two of us." "She sounds like it," Mara said. "Yeah," he said. Something in his voice had a quality that didn't have a clinical name, but that she recognized the specific, unguarded tiredness that comes when a person has been operating at maximum capacity for long enough that the performance layer drops away. "I'm tired, Mara, I know. Not just tonight." "I know that too," she said. The extraction vehicle arrived at 4 minutes and 50 seconds. Not Reyes, a woman she had never met, whose name she was not given, who drove with the focused calm of someone who understood the nature of the situation and did not require explanation. They got Farrell into the back. Vasquez went with him. Mara got in the front. She looked back at the federal building as they drove away. One lit window on the upper floor. She thought about Decker in his corridor somewhere, and whether he knew yet what had been found, and how long the name Reyes had given her had been sitting in a classified file that Decker had access to. She stopped thinking about Decker and looked at the road. They drove for 31 minutes to a location. She also was not given in advance a private medical facility, small, the kind of place that existed in the network of resources that certain programs maintained for exactly these contingencies. A physician she didn't know and didn't need to evaluated Farrell within 10 minutes of arrival. She gave the briefing her self-compound identity, timeline, current hemodynamic status, the exertion of the last hour, and then she stood outside the evaluation room and let someone else manage it for the first time in 18 hours. Her shoulder was a deep, persistent ache from the impact point radiating into her neck. She found a chair in the corridor, sat down, and finally let herself feel it. Not just the shoulder, all of it. The morning in the trauma room. Volk's voice, her badge on the counter, the parking structure, and the helicopters and Reyes on the phone saying, "We have a situation," and everything that had come after. The compound, and the dark, and the drive, and the shots, and Farrell's pulse under her fingers in 4 different vehicles, and the man in the maintenance coverall, and the outcomes log with its clean, clinical language for what Harrison Volk had done. To people who had come to his hospital, seeking care. She sat in the chair and felt it. And it was not a manageable quantity of feeling, but she was not trying to manage it. She was just letting it be what it was. After a while, Vasquez came and sat beside her. Neither of them said anything for several minutes. Then Vasquez said, "Your shoulder needs imaging." "I know. There's a machine here." "I know that too. Are you going to—" "In a minute," Mara said. Vasquez sat with her for the minute. That was a decent thing, and Mara noticed it. The shoulder was a grade 2 AC joint sprain. The imaging confirmed it hours later. No fracture, significant soft tissue damage that was going to be painful and limiting for several weeks and heal completely if she didn't do anything stupid. She accepted the sling and the medication instructions for the anti-inflammatory and ignored the part about activity restriction, because activity restriction existed on a spectrum, and she would interpret it as the situation required. Reyes arrived at the facility at 6:40 in the morning. He was shorter than she remembered, or she had been remembering a version of him from when she was younger, and everything felt larger. He had gray in his beard that was new, and he moved with a slight favoring of his right leg that she had not noticed before. He looked at her sling and said nothing about it, which was correct. They sat across from each other in a small room, with bad coffee and better information. "The name I gave you," he said. "It's been transmitted to the Inspector General's office, the Senate Oversight Committee, and 2 federal judges who are not in Decker's operational chain." He paused. "It's not going to be contained." "How long until it's public?" she asked. 48 hours, maybe less. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Decker is in custody as of 2 hours ago. The 3 men from the medical suite, we have their identities. They connect back to a Blackridge operational cell that has been active for at least 18 months. He looked at her steadily. "The task force is being restructured under independent oversight. Every case they've touched in the last 2 years is under review." She absorbed this. Volk, still in federal holding. His lawyer tried for bail this morning. Denied. Reyes paused. The charges were expanded overnight. The outcomes log added 4 counts of second-degree murder to the conspiracy and attempted murder charges. His career is over, and he will not see the outside of a federal facility for the remainder of his working life. She thought about the outcomes log, the clean, clinical language, adverse outcome. She thought about 4 people and their families and the specific cruelty of dying in a place that was supposed to protect you from exactly this. "The press statement," she said. "Going out at 9 this morning." He met her eyes. "Your name is in it. Your service record, to the extent of what can be disclosed. What you did in Trauma Room 1 yesterday morning, and what the compound was, and why Volk's sedative would have killed the patient." He paused. "The statement characterizes your suspension as wrongful and your intervention as the action that preserved Captain Farrell's life and initiated the sequence that exposed the Blackridge network." She looked at her coffee. "How do you feel about that?" Reyes asked. It was the kind of question he did not ask casually. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a week." He nodded. That was an answer he understood. At 9:07 that morning, the federal statement was released simultaneously to 7 major news organizations. She read it on her phone in the corridor of the private medical facility, sitting in the same chair she'd occupied for the last 2 hours, her arm in its sling, her coffee cold beside her. The statement was 4 pages. It named Harrison Volk, named the charges, named the Blackridge network, provided a partial account of the network's operational scope and the confirmed outcomes cases. It named Mara Solis, described her service background in the terms that were available, and stated clearly and specifically that her intervention in Trauma Room 1 at Hartwell Regional Medical Center had been medically correct, clinically necessary, and directly responsible for Captain Farrell's survival. Her phone started ringing at 9:12. She turned it face down. At 10:30, Voss arrived. He looked like a man who had not slept, which was accurate, and who had spent sleepless hours doing things that had produced results, which was also accurate. He sat across from her in the small room. He sat across from her and folded his hands on the table and looked at her with the expression of someone who is about to offer something that matters and is taking a moment to frame it correctly. Farrell is going to be all right, he said first. I know, she said. I checked his chart at 6. His pressure is up to 104/70. I saw, he almost smiled. The 3-degree version. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to hear it completely before you respond. Okay, she said. There is a program being built, he said. It's been in development for 14 months. The premise is that military operations increasingly occur in environments where conventional medical evacuation is not viable, and the gap between field trauma care and full surgical capability costs lives that do not need to be lost. He paused. The program would develop a unit of personnel with combined tactical and advanced trauma capabilities. The ability to operate in hostile environments, manage complex casualties, and make clinical decisions under conditions that would not exist in any civilian or conventional military medical context. He looked at her steadily. We need someone to build the training architecture, the clinical protocols, the personnel selection criteria. Another pause. Someone who has operated at both ends of that gap. Someone who understands what the gap actually costs. She was quiet. You would have full latitude on the program design, he said. Staffing decisions, training methodology, clinical standards. It reports directly to a chain of command that does not include anyone connected to Decker's former structure. He paused one more time, and you would not be anyone's floor nurse. She looked at her hands on the table. The left one below the sling, the right one, which had been steady in every moment over the last 24 hours, when steadiness was the only available option. She thought about the back corner of the break room and 3 years of last name address and the specific quality of being looked through rather than at. She thought about that, not with bitterness she had made the choice. She had constructed the invisibility herself. She had believed she needed it. She had been wrong in the specific way that people are wrong when they mistake self-protection for self-preservation. She thought about Farrell's pulse under her fingers. She thought about the man in trauma room 1 at 6:47 in the morning who had been dying by a mechanism that only she in that building understood, and the 23 seconds between understanding it and doing something about it, and what would have been true if she had let the moment pass. She thought about Volk's outcomes log, and the 4 names in the confirmed column, and the 9 in the possible column, and the 12 hospitals on the list, and what it meant that Blackridge had been operating for 6 years before yesterday. I have conditions, she said. I expected that, Voss said. The clinical protocols are mine, not subject to revision by anyone, without equivalent medical qualification. If someone without that qualification overrides a clinical decision in the field, I walk. Accepted. Personnel selection includes a psychological assessment component that I design. I've seen what happens to people who carry this kind of dual capability without the right foundation. I'm not building a unit of functional casualties. Accepted. And I want access to the Blackridge case files. All 13 hospitals. All the identified outcomes cases. Not as an investigator, as a medical consultant. She met his eyes. Those families deserved to know what happened to their people from someone who can explain it in terms that don't require a law degree. Voss was quiet for a moment. That one I'll have to work on. Work on it, she said. I'll wait. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he extended his hand across the table. She shook it. She went to see Farrell at 11:15. He was propped up in the medical bed, with better color than she had seen on him since the transport vehicle, his pressure reading on the monitor at 106/72, which was not where she wanted it long term, but was where she was prepared to accept it for now. He was eating something from a hospital tray with the focused determination of someone who understood that eating was a clinical priority rather than an appetite. He looked up when she came in. You look terrible, he said. You said that yesterday, she said. Yesterday you looked less terrible. Today you've lapped it. He looked at the sling. How bad? Grade 2, it'll heal. She sat in the chair beside his bed. Your pressure is better, Vasquez told me. He set down his fork. She also told me what happened in the medical suite last night. The 3 men. She said you handled all 3 of them. Vasquez helped. Vasquez said she didn't help, he said. She said she watched. He looked at her with the specific quality of attention that she had not seen from him since the field, since the version of their relationship that existed before she had tried to build a quieter life. What did Voss offer you? She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was something she had always respected about him, the capacity to receive information completely before responding to it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Are you going to take it? Yes, she said. Because you want to, or because it's available? It was the right question. It was the question that nobody else in the last 36 hours had thought to ask, including Voss, and it deserved a real answer. She thought about it honestly, the way she had thought about Reyes's question earlier. She examined the answer for the parts of it that were obligation and the parts that were fear and the parts that were simply the habit of moving toward emergencies, because that was what she had been built to do. And she looked for the part that was actually her Mara, not ghost, not mouse, not the designation or the diminishment, but the actual person underneath both of them. Because I'm the right person for it, she said. And because I'm tired of being useful in ways that nobody knows about. She paused. That's not the same as wanting credit. It's something different. He considered this. Recognition, he said. Not from other people, she said. From myself. She looked at her hands. I think I've been hiding for so long that I forgot the hiding was a choice. Like it just became the condition. She paused. It isn't the condition. It was a decision I made, and I can make a different one. Farrell looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, yeah, just that. The one word with the weight of someone who understood what it cost to arrive at that particular sentence. She nodded. She left him to his hospital tray and his better blood pressure and went to find a window because she had been inside since the previous morning and she needed to see the sky. The window at the end of the facility's main corridor looked west, over a section of city that was waking up into an ordinary Thursday cars on the road. A coffee shop sign visible 2 blocks away. A woman walking a small dog along the sidewalk with the focused disinterest of a daily routine. The city did not look like a place where anything particular had happened the day before. It looked like itself. Her phone had 47 missed calls and a volume of messages she was not going to address today. Several were from media outlets that had apparently obtained her name from the federal statement. Several were from Hartwell Regional's administrative team, which she found instructive, the hospital calling her now, on the morning after, when yesterday morning she had been handed back her badge and told termination paperwork would follow in 72 hours. She called none of them. She called one number. It rang twice. Del Rey, she said, when the second-year nurse from Hartwell Regional picked up. The young woman who had started to say something in the corridor and been gently stopped. It's Mara Solis. A pause. I saw the statement, Del Rey said. Her voice was doing something complicated. Are you okay? I'm all right, Mara said. I wanted to call before you heard it from someone else. She paused. I also want to say thank you for yesterday morning in the corridor. I didn't do anything, Del Rey said. You tried to, Mara said. That counts. A longer pause. What are you going to do now? Mara looked out the window at the street below. The woman with the dog had rounded the corner and was gone. The coffee shop sign was still there. Something that fits, she said. The federal press conference happened at 2 in the afternoon, and she watched it on a laptop in the facility's small common room, with Vasquez beside her and Ray standing in the doorway. The senior federal prosecutor read the charges against Harrison Volk conspiracy, 14 counts of illegal access to protected federal systems, 4 counts of second-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder for the Captain Farrell case, and his participation in the Black Ridge Strategic Network. The charges against the network's operational head, whose name was now public, were read separately broader, more complex. the kind of charge sheet that reflected years of architecture rather than individual acts. The prosecutor described what had happened in Trauma Room 1 at Hartwell Regional Medical Center at 8:17 the previous morning. She described it accurately and completely, including the compound, including the mechanism, including the fact that the attending physician had moved to administer a sedative that would have caused the patient's respiratory failure. She described Mara Solis' intervention, her service background in the terms that were reciprocal, and the outcome. She used the word correct twice. Mara's clinical assessment had been correct. Her intervention had been correct. The statement that Volk had given to the local news outlet the previous morning, the reckless nurse, the unclear background, the induced cardiac arrest, was addressed directly and specifically characterized as false. Mara watched the screen. She had a complicated relationship with public vindication, she discovered, sitting in that common room with bad coffee going cold beside her. It was not the simple, clean satisfaction that she might have expected if she imagined this moment abstractly. It was more specific than that and more personal, and it arrived alongside the memory of 3 years of the back corner of the break room and the last name address, and the particular look on Volk's face when he had said she is a floor nurse, as if that was the same thing as saying she is nobody. She had been somebody the entire time. That was the thing that sat with her, not with bitterness, but with the particular clarity of understanding something late that had always been true. She had not needed to become somebody. She had not needed the military to confirm it, or the federal statement to establish it, or General Aldrich Voss to explain it to a room full of people who had been looking through her for 3 years. She had been somebody the entire time. She had simply chosen, for reasons that made sense at the time and less sense in retrospect, to make herself invisible inside it. She would not make that choice again. Volk's perp walk was not televised federal arrests, did not work that way, but a photographer on the street outside the federal holding facility caught a clear image of him being transferred between buildings in handcuffs, and that image was on 3 news sites within the hour. She saw it once and didn't seek it out again. It was not satisfaction she felt, looking at it. It was something closer to sorrow, in the specific way that it is sorrowful when a person who plans to do good chose to do the opposite of good for long enough, that the two things became entirely impossible to separate. 4 people, 9 more under review. All of them had come to a hospital seeking care. She thought about that. She would continue to think about it. At 4 in the afternoon, she went back to Farrell's room. His pressure was 110/74. His color was the best she'd seen it. He was reading something on a tablet, and he set it down when she came in and looked at her with the alert, present quality that she had come to understand as his version of asking a question. "Voss wants to know your timeline," she said. "My timeline for what?" "Recovery? Return to duty." She sat. "He's building the program around your intelligence from the Blackridge case. There's exposure data in there that's going to define the threat parameters for the new unit." 2 months, Farrell said. "Minimum. Vasquez told me not to push it." "Vasquez is correct. Don't push it." He looked at her. "Are you going to be around for the 2 months?" She considered the question in all the ways it could be meant, and she answered the one she thought was closest to what he was actually asking. "I'll be building," she said. "The training architecture, the protocols. There's work to do before anyone's ready for personnel selection." She paused. "So yes, I'll be around." He nodded. Something settled in his expression. She stood to go. Then she stopped because there was a thing she had been carrying since the corridor outside the holding room the previous night, since the moment Reyes had given her the name, and she had felt the floor shift, and she had not yet put it down. "You trusted me with your life yesterday morning," she said, "without telling me that's what you were doing." "Yes," he said. That was a significant thing to do. "Yes," he said again. She looked at him for a moment. "Next time, tell me." Something around his eyes shifted. Not quite a smile, and not quite its absence. "Okay," he said. She walked out. The evening came in quickly. The way winter evenings did, the light going gray and then gone between 4 o'clock and 5, the temperature dropping with the speed of a season that had no patience. She stood outside the facility's rear entrance for 20 minutes in the cold, with her good arm crossed over the sling and her face turned up slightly, and let the air work against her skin, which was not a medical intervention, and was not a tactical decision, and was simply a thing she needed. She thought about the program Voss had described. She thought about the training architecture she would build, and the people she would select, and the protocols she would write, and the gap she would work to close, not just the tactical to clinical gap, but the other one. The one between what people were capable of and what they were permitted to believe about themselves. She had some relevant expertise there. She thought about a woman who had spent 3 years becoming smaller and quieter and more invisible in the belief that the world required that of her. And she thought about what it had cost and what had finally interrupted it. And she thought about the fact that a man had needed to nearly die in a trauma room before she had been willing to remember what she was. She would not wait for the next near thing. She had spent 7 years as Ghost. She had spent 3 years as Mouse. Both of those were true. Both of those were her. The woman who had performed surgeries in the field at 23 and the woman who had charted quietly in the back corner at 34 were not different people. They were the same person who had made different choices about how much of herself to put in the room. She was going to put more of herself in the room. Starting tomorrow. Starting with the blank document on a laptop she hadn't opened yet, where the training architecture would begin. Starting with the first page of protocols she would write from scratch, without apology, drawing on everything she had earned in every context she had ever occupied, the classified ones and the civilian ones and the ones that had existed in between. She was not Ghost. She was not Mouse. She was Mara Solis, and she was 34 years old, and she had reservation, and without reservation, stopped pretending that those were two separate things. Her phone buzzed. A text from Voss. "The program has a provisional name. Working title, Meridian. Your call whether it stays." She looked at the word for a moment. The meridian, the line that marks the highest point. The moment between what came before and what comes after. She typed back, "It stays." She put the phone in her pocket and stood in the cold for another minute, and then she went inside, because there was work to do, and she was the person who was going to do it, and that was not a burden she was carrying. It was simply, finally, who she was.